All right, so thank you all for coming. And thank you, JB, for your time and willingness to share your knowledge with us. I will start by introducing you before we jump into some questions that we have for you about your book and your work in general. So JB McKinnon, did I say that correctly?
Yep.
Okay. McKinnon is a Canadian journalist, contributing editor, and book author. He's best known for co-authoring with Elisa Smith the best-selling book, The 100-Mile Diet, a year of local eating, encouraging readers to focus on local eating as a way to address current environmental and economic issues. He also wrote the book, The Day the World Stops Shopping, a provocative, deeply researched thought experiment exploring what life beyond consumerism might look like and how we can get there. McKinnon and Smith also collaborated in the creation of the Food Network Canada television series, The 100-Mile Challenge, based on the book. He has won 6 National Magazine Awards and the 2006 Charles Taylor Prize for the best work of literary nonfiction. So thank you for your time with us. And I guess should we introduce ourselves as EcoPacks?
Sure.
Okay, so this is part of an EcoPacks event, our Sustainable Living series. I'm Lisa, a junior environmental science major.
And I'm Liam, an environmental science major, senior.
I'm Anika, a psychology senior.
So we are part of EcoPacks. Yeah, and so the first question we have for you is, what got you interested in exploring this thought experiment of what would happen if the world stops shopping?
Sure, thanks. What got me interested in it was really that I've been working on environmental issues as a journalist for more than 20 years now, I guess. And I started to realize that it didn't really matter which environmental issue I was looking at, whether it was depletion of water or deforestation or toxic pollution of waterways or even the trade in wildlife, climate change. Any of these things that I looked at, I realized that how much we consume is, if not the biggest driver of these environmental problems, then it's always certainly one of the biggest drivers of these problems. And I started to take a closer look at that. And one of the things I found right away was a UN panel that studies global natural resources. And in 2019, they'd issued a report that said that our consumption of goods, services, and consumer experiences was in fact the #1 driver of our environmental crises worldwide since about the year 2000. So that means that consumption is an even bigger problem globally now than the growth of the world's population. So how much each one of us consumes now matters more than how many of us there are. And I was really struck by that fact that there was this historic changeover in what was driving environmental problems, but also that nobody was talking about that subject. You know, we're really focused more these days on what I think of as the greening of consumption rather than reducing consumption. And so I thought a thought experiment in which we imagine what would happen if we drastically and suddenly reduced our consumption might be not only like an interesting way to explore the issue, but maybe an entertaining way to explore the issue, something that people would actually read.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is about consumerism and overconsumption. How is it connected to environmental issues such as climate change and deforestation, and especially like the water crisis that we have?
Well, really, it's connected directly just because all of the things that we consume are made of wood, they're made of metal, Water is involved in the production of those goods and services. Emissions result from, for example, the mining of metals, the smelting of metals, the transport of metals, the turning of metals into metal products, the shipment of those metal products around the world. So these things are actually I mean, there is no consumer good that you could point to that isn't, doesn't involve natural resources that typically your products are typically made of material resources. As I say, those have to be extracted. They have to undergo production. So everything you can think of, everything from a phone to the pot that you put a house plant in, anything from something as elaborate as a rocket to something as simple as a tiny toy is going to have some kind of footprint in terms of material, natural resources, and energy. So these things are actually so closely tied that in, for example, countries where they don't produce terrific data on how many emissions are being produced, how many carbon emissions are being produced, economists will actually just look at the scale of the consumer economy, and they will use that as a proxy to measure climate emissions, because these two things are just so tightly connected. When our consumption of goods and services goes up, emissions go up. And when they go down, they go down. And we saw this really clearly in the pandemic. So at the outset of the pandemic, when the large part of the global economy really just shut down and people were locked out of the consumer economy, we saw the sharpest and deepest drop in carbon emissions ever recorded. So turn the consumer economy off and you turn emissions down instantly. So it's that tightly tied. And that was true across the board. Deforestation slowed in the first months of the pandemic. Water use slowed down dramatically in the first months of the pandemic. All of these sorts of things, everything basically, all of the environmental crises were briefly lessened during those first months of the pandemic because the consumer economy had slowed down so dramatically.
And in what ways do you think we are over-consuming? Are there certain resources that we might be using more, or products that we are buying more of?
The problem is really just that consumption overall is just constantly increasing across the board. So there's sometimes certain products will start to disappear. For example, in the 1990s, cassette-based videos, disappeared and became DVDs and then eventually transformed into streaming. So you do see certain products that disappear, but overall consumption is always increasing. In fact, that is the goal of most government policy, because we have a consumer economy and because economic growth is very important to governments as a policy. We see constant stimulation of the consumer economy and constant growth in how much we consume. So when I was your age, 25 years ago, I was consuming radically less than the people in the room with you would be consuming who are at about that age now. And that's not because myself and other young people at that time were better people. It was just because the consumer economy wasn't running at such a high pace as it is now. So every single year around the world, virtually everybody is consuming more and more. So for example, if you just want to take a direct example of that, 20 years ago, people were buying half as many clothes as they are today. And again, that's not because we were better people 20 years ago. It's because the consumer economy hadn't adapted to the point that it has today to sell such a, such a dramatic increase in clothes to individual consumers.
Interesting. So now going to your book, that talks about the people of Namibia in the Kalahari Desert. How can we live, or how can we like learn from them in their sustainable lifestyle? Like, what can we take from them?
I think the reason my book starts in the Kalahari Desert in Namibia with an indigenous culture there, and the reason I started there was because something you often hear in conversations about consumption is that it's hardwired into us, right? That there's this belief, quite a widespread belief, that give us money and we will buy more stuff. That buying more stuff is hardwired. It's a hardwired desire in the human soul, I guess. And I went to Namibia to show that that's not the case, because this indigenous group in Namibia, they've had 120,000 years of continuous culture in more or less the same place, and they have never chosen to acquire large amounts of material goods. And they're well aware that those goods are out there. They have adopted some of the products. Cell phones are quite popular, but for the most part, they have chosen as a culture and as individuals to accumulate very few material goods. So I think the big lesson that we can take from that is that this is not hardwired into us. It's a cultural, it's a result of the direction that our culture and our society has taken. And we can choose to consume more and more, or in just as human a way, we can choose to consume the absolute minimum or anything in between. And any of these things are ways of being human that we know already exist.
That sort of segues into how there's sort of this push now for electric vehicles and just green products in general. And do you think switching to environmentally friendly products is the solution? Or is it just a way to become less bad, or to try to alleviate our consumption problem? Or do you think there are other solutions that?
Yeah, I think that, well, I guess what I'd say is that in the last 20 years, the direction that we've been taking in terms of sustainability is towards the greening of consumption rather than the reduction of consumption. So we've thought to ourselves, we can make every product more organic and more recyclable, maybe more biodegradable, more energy efficient, more circular, all of these buzzwords that you've heard. The problem is that it's not working, right? So we've actually made tremendous gains in energy efficiency, for example, over the last 20 years, and yet we're consuming more energy than ever before. And it's because even if you green all of our consumer goods, it becomes an impossible task to make consumption truly sustainable if it's constantly expanding. And if our starting point was unsustainable consumption, and then we expand it even further, and then we try to green it, we're just constantly playing catch up with the scale of our consumption. And the scale of our consumption keeps eating up the gains that are made by the greening of our consumption. I can give you one really specific example from the book that I thought was pretty interesting. And that was a study that was done in Japan. So Japan at one point said, we're going to make a big push to make big appliances in our country more energy efficient. So they said TVs, refrigerators, air conditioners, things like this. We're gonna make a big push to find a way technologically to make those things more energy efficient, and they succeeded. So they, I think it was 5, maybe 7 years later, they'd found a way to make TVs, refrigerators, and air conditioners 70% more energy efficient. And then these researchers went in and said, okay, well, let's see, is that reducing actual energy consumption? What they found was energy consumption had gone up. And even energy consumption associated with TVs, refrigerators, and air conditioners had gone up. So how could that have happened? What they found was that people realized that when they bought an energy efficient television, for example, they saved money on their energy expenditure, like they've spent less money on electricity. So then they took that money and they spent it to do things like buy a second TV or buy a third TV or buy a bigger TV. And the same thing with refrigerators. They would, they'd get an energy efficient refrigerator and then they'd say, well, since it's energy efficient, I'll get one that's twice the size of my old TV or my old refrigerator. Or since I'm saving money on my air conditioner, I'll put an air conditioner in every room. So this kind of consumer mentality ate up all of the savings, not only ate up all of the energy savings, but actually added energy consumption to the system. So this is the problem, is that if we're living in a consumer culture with a consumer mindset, it's very difficult for us to make the sustainability gains that we're trying to make through things like recycling and energy efficiency and biodegradables and all of these other aspects.
Liam, do you want to ask the next?
So can you kind of describe like how we can live with buying less? How do we move beyond consumerism?
That's a big question.
Describe some of the.
Yeah.
I think
With this, like, is there a way that we can reduce our consumption without causing economic collapse?
Yeah, I think there is. But what we need to do is do it in a planned way. So in my book, I just abruptly cut off consumption and play out what happens. And the first part of the book is like a disaster movie. It's, the total collapse of the world economy, essentially. Because that is what we know happens. If we are so dependent on consumption to make our economy function right now, that if we stop consuming, it causes really serious harm. And we saw that too at the start of the pandemic. We saw businesses closing their doors. We saw millions of people worldwide out of work, these sorts of things. So this question of reducing consumption is one that has to be taken seriously and planned for. But how can we do it? One way is, I think a good example is something like the clothing industry, where, as I said, people are buying twice as many clothes as they were 20 years ago or so. But the other part of that equation is that those clothes last half as long as they used to. So the clothing that we're buying today is cheaper, but it's also more disposable. So what if we reversed course on that? What if we started moving back in the direction of clothing that was more durable, that was designed to survive through multiple fashion cycles? What would happen? What would happen on, from the consumer side is that we would buy fewer things. We'd probably pay more for the clothes that we bought, but we'd buy fewer of them and they would last longer. We'd keep them with us longer in our lives. So we'd ultimately end up buying fewer clothes. What would happen on the business side? You would think that if you reduce the number of clothes being produced, then that automatically means just a gigantic sweep of job losses. But that's not necessarily the case. So what you can have is, well, what you have to think about, I guess, is things like, if you produce higher quality clothing, then it usually requires more labor to produce that higher quality clothing. That means more hours of work go into each of those articles of clothing. That means more jobs per article of clothing. So you're not necessarily going to lose as many jobs, even in production of a lower number of goods. But then there are also other aspects to this. For example, you might build the secondhand clothing market, and that creates jobs, because if you're creating clothing that's more durable, then it can last through more than one owner. So secondhand sales can become a bigger part of the economy. Things like alterations and repairs of this durable clothing can become a larger part of the economy. And that would be particularly true of things like appliances, which have also seen a very steep decline in product lifetimes. Well, if you are designing appliances to last for a longer period of time, then you can have a much larger segment of the economy dedicated to maintaining and repairing those products across their lifetimes. So you start to see that, it's a different economy, but it's an economy that's busy with some new types of activities, but also with the older types of activities. And it wouldn't necessarily have to mean a total economic collapse. It would be more of a transition. And interestingly, you do now see companies that are doing these things. So companies like Patagonia, Levi's has started moving in this direction, where they're starting to say, look, we want to sell you as an individual fewer pieces of clothing than we did in the past. We're going to make them durable so that you can hang on to them for a longer period of time. We're going to try to take back our products from the market when it's time to sell them as secondhand products. So they're making secondhand sales a larger part of their business model, and they're doing alterations and repairs. So we actually see significant global brands starting to move in this direction, but not very many of them. Not enough, that's for sure.
And that sort of segues into the question of what would we gain with living with less?
Oh, I mean, we'd gain a lot, I think. We'd gain, for one thing, there is, even if we just look at what we were just talking about, it's satisfying to keep products for a long period of time. One of the biggest gains we would get, of course, is improvement across all of the environmental problems that we're facing, from water consumption through to climate change. We would see, in the same way that in the pandemic, we saw things like the return of wildlife to spaces that it hadn't used for a long time. If we reduce our consumption, we can start to see that kind of regeneration of the natural world that we haven't seen in a very long time. We haven't seen anything except the gradual diminishment of the planet rather than its regeneration. So, I mean, I think that would be deeply satisfying. But there are cultural questions in it as well. And one is that we would, ideally, well, let's put it this way, in the cultures that do consume less than, for example, Americans and Canadians. So these would be cultures like the Scandinavians, for example. In those countries, you see a lot less status competition around what you own. Generally, those countries have narrower gaps between rich and poor. And a result of that is that people don't feel as driven to compete with each other for status based on what they wear, what car they drive, the furnishings they have in their homes, these sorts of things. And again, in the pandemic, particularly early in the pandemic, you saw a lot of people online talking about the sense of relief they had from that pressure, talking about how it was nice to just, not have to shop, not have to dress up for work in a different outfit every day. So there's, I think a lot of us don't really appreciate how much pressure we are under to show signs of success in a materially, consumeristically oriented world. And the relief from that might be one of the bigger benefits of shifting towards a lower consuming society.
How optimistic are you that we can shift our society's perspective and kind of overcome the big businesses that are still pushing this high consumerism ideology? Are you optimistic that we can shift and make it to a new society with less consuming?
I guess the way I think about that question is can it happen? Is it happening? There are signs. For example, the businesses I mentioned that are moving towards this different business model. In Europe, France has banned, they have a law against planned obsolescence, planned obsolescence is when a product is designed to fail earlier than the consumer might expect the product lifespan to last. If a product is designed to at some point just give up the ghost deliberately in order to make the consumer have to constantly go back and buy the same product again and again. France actually has a law against that. Sweden has shifted its tax regime so that the repair of products is more inexpensive than it used to be, so that repairing something can make economic sense rather than just throwing it out, replacing it with a new thing. So there's all these concrete steps that can be taken and are being taken out there, but they're a very small part of the economy right now. But the bigger question is could we move in this direction? And of course we can. And what I think about here is 20 years ago, the idea of greening consumption was considered very utopian. The idea that we would ever convince corporations that they needed to reduce their water consumption or reduce their energy consumption or make their products recyclable or make their products biodegradable. I mean, that idea was quite radical 20 years ago, and very few companies were engaged with it. 20 years later, today, it's hard to find a major company that isn't at least putting up the pretense of trying to pursue sustainability. So that, I think the same kind of thing could happen with reducing consumption. If the same kind of movement occurs, if it becomes a big part of the public conversation about how to achieve sustainability, then we might very well, 20 years from now, see companies operating on business models that reduce the primary consumption of their goods. And the great thing about that would be that, unlike the greening of consumption, it would work. It would succeed in reducing our environmental impacts in a way that greening consumption has yet to do.
Should we move on to?
Yeah.
Yeah, does anyone in the audience have questions for JP? Yes.
Yeah, my question is, so a big part of American culture is the consumption of over-reliance on cars.
Can you hear okay? Or
I can't hear the question. You might need to repeat it for me.
Okay,
Uh,
part of American culture is the consumption of cars. I was wondering if how do we need to move away from that and how?
Yeah, or should we repeat it?
The question was how a large part of American culture is the overconsumption of cars, and if we should move away from that, or how we can move away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely car culture is a really big part of American culture and North American culture in general, I think. But you can move away from it in a pretty similar way. For example, if we price products, so another big idea that's embedded in the idea of reducing consumption is finding ways to make the price of a product better reflect the environmental and social consequences of that product. So this is sometimes called true cost pricing. So it includes the costs of climate change emissions, or it includes the environmental costs of extracting minerals and metals from the earth, or it includes the cost of fresh water use, these sorts of things. The production of toxins in automobile paint, the production of toxins in the production of electric batteries. So if we move towards a model that valued natural resources at a higher rate, then the price of goods increases, and people are less inclined to, say, buy a new car every 5 years. And they might go back to hanging onto their cars for 10 or 15 or even 20 years, as used to be quite common in the United States and elsewhere. So, that's an example of the kind of concrete policy type step that could be taken that would help reduce consumption. But it's cultural too. It's one of these things where you kind of have to, some of the reductions in consumption have to come from just having a lot more conversations like this one, a lot more conversations that turn what it means to be a responsible environmental citizen into a conversation about consumption, and try to shift the culture to a point where we wouldn't necessarily be seeing on television the lives of celebrities and billionaires showing off extremely extravagant and completely unsustainable lifestyles, and then considering those the lifestyles to aspire towards. So culture is a big part of it as well.
Sorry, first.
Can you hear me, or?
Yeah.
Do you think that the shift away from consumerism, like a consumeristic society, goes along with shifting from a capitalist society to maybe a more socialist society, where people aren't focusing on just working, surviving, and focusing more on community? And how does that tie into consumerism?
Well, certainly, I guess what I'd say there is, on an evidence-based level, societies that are more socialist generally consume less than capitalist societies. There might be a bunch of different reasons for that, but one of the key ones is that socialist societies redistribute wealth more effectively. So they, as I said, the gap between rich and poor is generally much narrower in more socialist countries. That's true even between Canada and the United States. The gap between rich and poor is somewhat narrower in Canada because it is a somewhat more socialist leaning nation generally. And you do see, well, there are two effects of that affect consumption. One is the one that I mentioned before, which is this keeping up with the Joneses effect, that gets very distorted when you have a very wide gap between rich and poor, because you could be living a completely comfortable life materially, but if you're constantly exposed to people who are much, much wealthier than you, who have who are on television or in daily life, clearly have far more resources and much higher status than you do in society because of their wealth, then you're going to aspire towards that lifestyle and towards that wealth. In countries where there's a narrower bandwidth of gap between rich and poor, you see a lot less pressure that way. And in fact, in countries like Finland, which is a country I look at in the book, a number of people there told me that millionaires in Finland find it frustrating because they aren't really able to show off their wealth, because they aren't publicly rewarded for it. The public looks down on people who show off wealth above and beyond what the average person has. So it creates cultural pressure as well. So that's one aspect of it, is it reduces this drive to consume more, to maintain your sense of dignity in society. The other part of it is that there's research just that shows that if you look around yourself and you see a lot of people who seem to be much wealthier than you and to have more resources than you, psychologically, it makes us feel materially unsafe. It makes us feel like maybe we just don't have enough to survive, literally. And it's kind of an ancient psychological impulse. So being surrounded by people who have very big consumer lifestyles and very obvious wealth can just make us feel insecure about our ability to make it to the finish line in life, and that can drive us again to things like overwork and overconsumption. So yeah, certainly you see those two pressures are reduced in more socialistic cultures.
Gino, do you have a question?
Yeah, kind of going back to the culture of consumerism, and how do we change, I guess, the mindset of being, in probably the most popular terms, to be more minimalistic. I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate. How does that culture kind of look like, I guess, in North America during the most consumer time of the year where it's skyrocketing, Black Friday, the holidays, when you are having conversations with either your significant other or your children, your parents saying, hey, don't get me any gifts, or hey, kids, I'm not going to give you as many gifts as you want, or Black Friday shouldn't have these crazy deals and that shouldn't really be a thing. Or, I mean, there's some companies that are doing good things, like Patagonia actually makes their items more expensive during Black Friday, and all their profits go to like nonprofit organizations, or they might say like, hey, we're actually not going to promote anything. But for the most part, most companies aren't like that. That's the most consumer time of the year. What is that going to look like if we were to do this different kind of consumerism society?
Well, a really interesting thing happens when people reduce their consumption, and that is that advertising slows down. And this is really consistent through history. If you look at the pandemic, if you look at recessions through time, when people don't spend as much money, the amount of advertising slows down. There's less money in the system to produce the advertising, but also there's just a sense, I guess, that why do it? Why throw them out there if people aren't buying? And this is why, if you go to a country like a country I went to for this book, Ecuador, as you can tell, I consumed a lot of flights to produce this book, but I went down to Ecuador because Ecuador has quite a sustainable level of consumption right now, but also is considered a highly developed nation by the United Nations. So I wanted to take a look at what that looked like. And one thing that really stood out was that because people aren't consuming as much in that country, there's far less advertising. And I remember flying out of Ecuador it's amazing how quickly you forget what the advertising landscape looks like in the country you're coming from. Because I flew from Ecuador and I landed in Dallas Fort Worth Airport on my way home and was instantly just blown away by the scale of advertising that is just washing over us every day in countries like the US and Canada. And so yeah, one potential benefit, I suppose, of reducing consumption is it tends to lower the marketing pressures to consume as well. So, but I want to jump to your point about the minimalists, and because it's a good one. What we see through history is that you have these movements towards lower consuming lifestyles, and they come up again and again. There was a strong, I mean, they go way back into the 1920s, 1930s, but some from more recent history were the hippies. There's quite a strong anti-consumer movement within the hippie movement. In the 1970s, kind of the first wave environmentalists were talking a lot about simpler living. In the mid and late 1990s, when I was college age, there was a very big movement towards voluntary simplicity and downshifting. At one point in the 1990s, 1 in 5 Americans was saying that they had deliberately reduced their consumption of goods and services. So that was a really big movement and almost completely forgotten. Now, there hadn't really been one through the 21st century until now. So in recent years, we've seen minimalism and this move towards thrifting and things like that. That's mostly been associated with Gen Z. But what we see is that it's cyclical. These movements emerge, they make a little bit of a cultural mark, and then they fade away. They get blown away by the next big wave of consumerism. So what that tells me is that these movements are important, but they're not enough. If we want to move towards a lower consuming culture, then we have to do more than turn it into a cultural trend. We need to actually make concrete changes to the structure of the economy and the structure of society. And so those are the things I'm talking about, things like true cost pricing, or this movement towards more durable products, towards the right to repair legislation that actually President Biden has talked about trying to implement. You need to have real significant pressure on companies to change their business models. Those are the things that can make a lasting change. And it can start with these movements like minimalism. They're important, but it has to get beyond the individual and into system level change for it to really stick.
I'm curious if you have personally seen any change in your own lifestyle since researching and writing this book, and if that change has affected, I don't know, your happiness or the way that you feel like.
That's a great question. I had already taken some steps around changing my consumer lifestyle before. I mean, just being an environmental journalist tends to push you towards changes in your lifestyle. But actually, the thing that struck me most was that, I talked to some psychologists about how the psychology of our societies would need to change potentially if we were to consume less. And so I spoke to this guy named Tim Kasser, who's probably the leading psychologist who studies materialism. And materialism is just defined as a value set that's oriented towards possessions, income, and status. So he says, if we turned away from consumption, we would kind of have to turn away from materialism as well. because if if we start consuming less, then how valuable as a status marker would possessions and income be? It wouldn't be as valuable anymore because we weren't all about accumulating possessions anymore. So it would create kind of a crisis in materialism as a value set, and that means that we'd have to find some other values to pursue. And he pointed out that the kind of values we might turn towards would be things like building stronger relationships with people we care about, or building a stronger relationship with the natural world, getting out into nature more, mastering new skills, which is like known to be deeply satisfying. These are all things that are, or developing like an authentic sense of yourself. So these are all the kinds of things that are known from psychological studies to be truly satisfying to us as individuals, where materialism is the opposite. Materialism is satisfying for us very briefly. Like you buy a new thing and you're like thrilled with the new thing, and then 2 days later, you don't really care that much about the new thing. You need another new thing. Materialism doesn't work very well at creating deep, lasting satisfaction. So what I realized out of that was that I had been reducing my consumption, but I hadn't been replacing it with anything else. So in a way, I was just creating a void in my life. So I did start to focus more on spending more time with people I care about, friends and family members. I've tried to get out into nature more. I've focused on taking some of those kinds of steps towards creating different values to live by than materialism and consumerism, and that is where the really strong personal benefits have emerged. I mean, it does seem very clear to me that going down that value path, that alternative value path, is more satisfying. Like it's a little bit harder work, but it's ultimately more, much more satisfying than just thinking of the next thing I might want to buy, earning the money to buy it, and getting it. So that's probably the biggest change for me personally that's come out of the research into this book.
Yes, Steve?
As I get older, I see things differently now, and I'm using language that I wouldn't normally use, but I see us as having a deep spiritual problem. And not in the way of we need to know Jesus, but we value the wrong things. I'm trying to get my head around, how do we solve this problem? How do we teach this to our children and our young people? It's just a way that I'm framing it. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, because another of the things that comes through loud and clear in the research and the history around this is that throughout much of the history of civilization, religious groups have been the strongest, some of the strongest critics. In fact, historically, they were the strongest critics of consumerism and materialism, because they recognized that if we invest a ton of our time and energy into the acquisition of goods and the generation of income and competition around status, then we have less time for spiritual pursuits. So a great example of that is a Sabbath, right? But up until I guess the early 1990s, it was completely ordinary across much of the world for the entire commercial apparatus to shut down once a week. And that was actually challenged. The Sabbath was challenged multiple times in the Supreme Court of the United States. And what the court ultimately said was, it was challenged on the grounds that it was giving privilege to a Christian tradition. And the court said no. The court said no. It may have origins in a Christian tradition, but it has become something that's valuable across every walk of life. And it's a break. It was recognized as a break from commercial culture that people from all creeds and all walks of life had come to appreciate in the United States. Not too long after that court decision, the Sabbath just started to die off anyway under all kinds of social and cultural pressures. But it's interesting to think that it wasn't that long ago that we blocked off a whole day every week in which most people didn't work and you couldn't shop. And that's a big chunk of time. I think it's 15%, I guess, of the week, where you would have to turn your interests and values to something other than shopping. Now, is it even possible to bring something like that back? I'm not sure, because of the internet, right? I mean, we have commerce available 24/7, 365 days a week on the internet. But it reintroduces this idea that's quite powerful, that it is ultimately a question of time. It's not that people don't want to pursue these other more satisfying values, or even don't have an interest, for example, in broadening their spiritual lives. It's that we don't have very much time to do that in modern society, because we have to work a lot to earn the money, and then we have to take quite a bit of time to spend that money and to participate in consumer culture, because that's what it means to participate in the culture of our times.
We have time for one more question. Right. Do you have any final advice you want the audience to take away from this session as we come to a close?
Well, two quick things. I guess one is that it's, I do encourage people, despite what I said about it not being all about individual action, I do encourage people to try, think about areas in your life where you could reduce your consumption, but also think about what you could replace that with, how you could start to turn towards this alternative value set that can make a lower consuming life more satisfying. I do think that's really important. But the main thing I would say, if I had a wish for this event, then it would be that people would go out and start conversations about this topic, because I think we're at the stage right now where the idea of reducing consumption is still, it's at the margins of our conversations around sustainability, and it should be at the center of those conversations. So if the people in this room went out and started those conversations, that is genuinely a very important action that people can take at this particular point in the movement towards a lower consuming society.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming.
Thanks. Yeah, no, absolutely my pleasure. This is the kind of conversation I'm talking about, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been great, thank you.
Good.
I'll consider getting your book too.
Appreciate that.